Good morning. So, is Watchtower persecuted or the persecutors? Well, we know that they are being persecuted in some lands such as Russia and so on. But are they also persecuting some of their followers? Now, Jesus didn't hide the difficulties that Christians would have in following him. In Matthew 10, he made it clear, and he said this in verse 17. Beware of men, they will hand you over to the Sanhedrins and scourge you in their synagogues. And in verse 22, he said, you will be hated by all men on account of my name. Now that's interesting, isn't it? That it was the religious courts that would deal out the persecution. And that is what has happened to us. We've been called before Watchtower's religious courts, and we have been persecuted by them with false accusations, and they've destroyed our reputations and taken us away from our families. So we need to expect this, but how did this happen? What caused Watchtower to do this? Well, as I've said in other videos, that they are not following scripture, that their judicial system is unlawful. In one instance, for instance, they have ignored Romans 13, where it says that governments have the God-appointed position in order to deal with crimes. Watchtower ignored that and believed that they could deal with child abuse problems, which we know quite a lot about now. Then, of course, there were situations where women would go to them with abusive husbands and they would go with injuries. And the elders would send them back home and say, look, just go and be a good wife. And I know of one instance where a woman did what the elders told her to do, and she ended up with broken ribs. Now, Watchtower's responsible for that because they ignored 1 Corinthians 7, which says that a couple can separate, and they should have done in this instance. Then, of course, there's jealousy. I have heard so many stories where elders get jealous of the position and maybe the enthusiasm for the ministry that others have, and they start nitpicking. There was one sister who was extremely enthusiastic for the ministry. She had a lot of Bible studies. But of course, it bothers the consciences of the elders. So they use their power to start nitpicking. They say things like, oh, we think you're too flamboyant, or maybe we don't like the colour of your handbag. Silly things like this come up, and eventually they manage to reprove this poor woman on false accusations. And it destroyed her. Dreadful thing to do. So we're going to come back to that matter because she was reproved, and that's an interesting thing that happened to her. Now, the other thing with elders is that there are no checks on them. There's no supervision from, except in some cases where they're told to phone the branch office. But in general, elders are loose cannons and do whatever they want in the congregation. And their silly rules contribute to false accusations. Now, I'm going to go on to Matthew 5, because Jesus said an interesting thing about being persecuted, but I'm going to take it from the New World Translation. And Jesus said here, in verse 10, 11 and 12, happy are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake. And then in 11 he said, happy are you when people reproach you and persecute you and lyingly say every sort of wicked thing against you for my sake. Now, isn't that what Watchtower have done? Some of you have objected to the Watchtower policies on child abuse, and you've been disfellowshipped, and your name has been damaged by the announcement that you've been disfellowshipped. Your family have been taken away from you. This is the sort of thing that Watchtower is doing. They're destroying your reputation. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus went on to say in verse 22, he's talking about what causes these sort of things. And he said, you mustn't continue wrathful or jealous or any other emotion that elders have, which causes them to make false accusation. And he said, anyone who says, you despicable fool, or in other words, if they destroy your reputation, they will be liable to fiery Gehenna. So what is there about this that we can be happy about? Well, when you're going through it, not much, obviously. But when you come out of it, there's the satisfaction that you've stood up for what is right. You've been persecuted for it, but it hasn't broken your faith in God. You've kept that strong. And that's something to be really happy about. Well, satisfied anyway. And as Jesus said, he said, rejoice and leap for joy, a hard thing to do. But your reward is great in the heavens. Our loving Father knows what we're going through. He will not stop wicked men doing evil things, but he watches what we do and how we keep our faith and love in God. And he loves us dearly for doing that. And keep in mind, we have a lovely reward at the end of it. But basically, we do it for our love for God. Thank you for watching this morning.